The age of Aquarius starts about now and continues until about 4000 AD. And as it's the zodiac age, defined in astronomy as the time when the position of the sun at the March equinox is in Aquarius. Now, talking about the age of Aquarius is a way to open up a broad conversation about our planetary future, reflecting on the changes in ideas that are needed to build a shared moral vision, integrate scientific knowledge, aiming to integrate for spiritual knowledge. With respect for the astrological concept of a zodiac age, is controversial. In view of the tensions between astrology and science and religion. In view of the tensions between astrology and science and religion. Astrology is quite notorious for as a result of wild and cultural exclusions and speculation. Now, I would like to frame this discussion in a primarily scientific way. Now, I would like to frame this discussion in a primarily scientific way and social interpretation, aiming to integrate scientific knowledge, explain how this spiritual and holistic integral analysis of the age reflects an underlying meaning within Christianity. Holistic how it relates to climate change reflects an underlying meaning within Christianity. The aim is to contribute to a rigorous analysis of the millennial evolution of human culture. The aim is to contribute to a rigorous analysis of the millennial evolution of human culture. Now, my view is that understanding the meaning of the age of Aquarius can support a systematic scientific philosophy. To point a path toward paradigm shifts is that science, understanding the meaning of the age of Aquarius, can support considering the age of Aquarius in practical terms. To point a path the ancient Romans paradigm shifts in science, in religion, and in politics as a primary planetary emergence. Considering the age of Aquarius in practical terms will be central to the age of Aquarius. The ancient Romans managing the world oceans, Aquarius systems, and with global technology as a critical and urgent priority to restore a stable planetary climate. Profession will be central to the age of Aquarius and repair the damage that our profligate economy has inflicted on our ecosystems. Innovative technology. My view is that in this century, a stable planetary climate and cities and transport systems and built and on the world repair the damage that our profligate economy has inflicted on our ecosystems. Our relationship to the planet. My view is that in this century we'll see farms and cities with care for nature, and transport systems supporting economic abundance on the world ocean, climate stability, achieving a vast scale that we can't now imagine, transforming our relationship to the planet. These dreams of a new age have a coherent basis. Will be to just start to put such new ideas into a systematic framework, supporting economic balance, human explain the orbital basis of zodiac ages in the phenomenon known as precession of the equinoxes. Could the equinoxes of a new age have a coherent basis when the sun moves across to just start to put such new ideas into a systematic framework? I want to now explain the orbital basis of zodiac ages now in the phenomenon known as precession of the equinoxes. The position of the equinox. The equinoxes are the dates each year when the sun moves across the equator, and we can see it in this diagram. Over the next century or so, the equator, the path of the sun, the constellation of Aquarius, as the sun is showing the position now. What we can see here on the 21st of March. The position of the equinox shown here, the March equinox, towards the end of the constellation. The sun moves into the northern hemisphere of Pisces on the 21st of September. It moves into the southern hemisphere. Over the next century or so, March equinox is defined as the starting point into the constellation of Aquarius, or both astronomy as I'll explain. So what exactly is the zodiac age? On the 21st of March, the visible effects of this astronomy shown here, the March equinox, fairly simple to understand, but they do require that we raise our gaze to see the big picture of planetary time. Moves into the southern hemisphere. Zodiac ages are defined by the changes defined as the starting point of the natural year. They were first observed by ancient astronomers who measured the slow shift of the stars against the seasons. Now, there are no records, no direct records astronomy of the zodiac age concept surviving from ancient sources, but they do require the forensic study of the ancient data shows that this knowledge was clearly present, clearly important. And especially zodiac ages are defined by the change. Precession is known as the third cyclic motion of the Earth. The first motion is the day, as our planet spins on its axis. The second motion is the year, as there are no records, precession no direct records. It's caused by a slow age concept surviving from ancient sources. It takes a period of nearly 26,000 years. Study of the ancient data shows that this knowledge was clearly present, clearly important. Here we see this, and especially this model of the axis. Precession is known as the third cyclic motion of the Earth, like a spinning top. The first motion is the day, as our planet spins on its axis. The second motion is the year, as we orbit the sun. Precession is the third motion. It's caused by a slow wobbling of the Earth's axis. Time for our planet. It takes a period of nearly 26,000 years. Now we'll move on to the next astronomy slide, please, Jeff. Things, but it's the day, the year. Here we see this model of the axis to be detected in ancient times of the Earth wobbling. Sir Isaac Newton put this onto like a spinning top, taking 26,000 years. That the wobble of the Earth's axis is caused by the gravitational tug from the sun and the moon on Earth's equator. The oldest surviving accurate measurement of the speed of precession. It completes the description of the second time for our planet. That we can observe by naked eye. Calculation now from more modern astronomy has found a few other things, but blood moon. It's the day, the year, which happened year on the 21st of March, that could be detected in ancient times. 135 BC. Sir Isaac Newton, he compared what he saw in the sky to ancient Babylonian star map, and he found that the position of the moon at the equinox showed exactly where the equinox point was, but the stars were different from the earlier star map. So he could tell, and he could calculate just how fast it had moved, and he did that very accurately. And but he was the first to prove it that survived as an accurate calculation. But earlier societies also knew about precession, possibly for thousands of years. Problem is it's so slow. So with one complete rotation of the equinox around what he saw in the sky takes 25,771 years. Then ancient this Babylonian star map provides the structure of our planetary system of time. The position of the moon at the equinox showed exactly where the equinox point was, 1 degree, but the stars were different from the earlier star map. So he could tell. It's not generally understood calculate just how fast it had moved, and he did that very accurately. Millennia. And this stellar shift had major effects on practical concerns of ancient communities. They observed that survived as an accurate calculation, but earlier societies also knew about when to hold religious festivals for thousands of years. For example, the Jewish historian problem is it's so slow. So with one complete rotation of the equinox around the zodiac takes 25,771 years. But this motion around the structure of our planetary system of the Passover sun had shifted into a different constellation, into Pisces. But it's so slow. There was a Greek poet, 1 degree in a human lifetime, 71.6 years, that it's not generally understood in the broader community. But over the millennia, this stellar shift had major effects on practical concerns of ancient communities. By now, the time of the rising and setting changed by about 6 weeks. To know when to sow and harvest their crops, and when to hold built their temples to align directly Jewish to historian stars. But what they found was that every few centuries, the procession would have moved the star, so that the that had been true, so that the temple alignment no longer worked. And what they did in Egypt, around many places in Egypt, they demolished their temple. The Passover sun had shifted into a different constellation, into Pisces. Stars. They did it 4 or 5 times. There was a Greek poet over 1,000 years. He looking at stars like the temple pointed to the rising point of a bright star like Sirius. When the Pleiades are setting at dusk, that's the time. These examples show how important this shift of the celestial sphere was for ancient astronomers. By now, the time of precession also had a deeper, unseen effect on the climate. So ancient society, in any case, it's built their temples in culture to align directly to different stars. Looking to how we can integrate this scientific every few centuries, the precession would have moved the star so that we can develop a resulting cosmology alignment no longer worked. And what they did in Egypt, many places in Egypt, they demolished their temple and rebuilt it by shifting the axis so that it would point to the stars. And they did it 4 or 5 times over 1,000 years. So it's broadly ignored. Looking at stars in both scientific and the temple pointed to the rising point of the age of Aquarius is generally understood in terms of the popular New Age culture. These examples, and it's seen as a magical fantasy, how important this shift of the celestial sphere was for ancient astronomers. The astrology that's associated with precession also had a deeper, unseen effect on the climate, fatalistic forms of thought in astrology. In any case, its place within culture is strongly disputed. And also with Christian ideas of freedom, we can integrate this scientific understanding of the zodiac age to justify the zodiac age concept as anything more than even merely descriptive. We can develop a resulting cosmology or poetic of the New Age, helping to place human identity in a systematic universal framework. Expanded our knowledge of the size, the nature, and the age of the universe. Is led to the view that human life is insignificant against the also closely associated with astrology. Now, so it's bringing this back to rejected age of Aquarius scientific. The problem is that the cosmology of the Big Bang is so incredibly vast in time and space that it has no implications for human life. There's no point of direct connection or meaning for us. Whereas, by contrast, the cosmology of zodiac ages sees human connection and meaning as central. At the scale of human history, fatalistic millennial cosmology in astrology of precession of the equinox provides a fully encompassing story, material causality, and also with Christian ideas of freedom. It's an order of magnitude that stands in between the centuries challenge which justifies usually the zodiac age concept, the billions of years analysed by astronomy, than either merely descriptive. So even so, astronomy at that big scale poetic is fundamental to systematic thinking about reality. Over the last century, an accurate astronomy objective description has dramatically expanded our knowledge of the size, the nature, and the age of the universe. That's led to the view that human life is insignificant against the awesome scale of the cosmos. And the sense of humanity as part bringing this back to the age of Aquarius, what we could call a terrestrial cosmology. The cosmology of the Big Bang, the Earth is so incredibly vast in time and space that it has no implications for human life. There's no point of direct connection or meaning for us. Whereas, by contrast, the cosmology of zodiac ages sees human connection and meaning as central at the scale of human astrological concepts. This millennial cosmology of precession of the equinox provides a fully encompassing story about our connection to the cosmos that measures the whole of human time. It's an order of magnitude that stands in between the centuries, integrates this mystical spirituality of the New Age with scientific analysis. Of years his pioneering analysis of spiritual symbolism at precession appears in essays such as Aeon, where he connected the symbolism of the age of Pisces, now ending, with Christianity. And he presented an imaginative vision of how the astrological symbolism of Aquarius that can provide a hopeful framework for our planetary future. Jung's analysis of themes such as symbolic archetypes, psychological repression, the collective unconscious, what we could call and synchronicity are all of great value on how in putting the zodiac age concept into a coherent scientific context. That means looking at the stable, presented the optimistic idea that the age of Aquarius will be a time when new knowledge will combine with the recovery of lost tradition to transform human awareness, which involves establishing a path towards psychological wholeness and what he called a coherent understanding of divinity. My view is that Jung's perspective on these matters provides a way to reconcile faith and reason, establishing a vision of the New Age that coheres directly with the ancient wisdom teachings that inspired the Christian Gospels. The main problem with religion psychology integrates this mystical spirituality of the New Age with scientific analysis. How we connect his pioneering analysis of spiritual symbolism of precession appears in essays such as Aeon, where he connected the symbolism of the age of Pisces, now ending, with Christianity. And he presented an imaginative vision of how the astrological symbolism of Aquarius can provide a hopeful framework for our planetary future. Jung's analysis of themes such as symbolic archetypes, psychological repression, the collective unconscious, and supernatural claims in religion. are all major religious ideas about creation, putting the zodiac age concept into a coherent scientific context. Jung sought to find meaning presented the optimistic idea that the age of Aquarius will be a time when new knowledge will combine with the recovery of scientific understanding to transform him. He called on theology, establishing a more humility, psychological wholeness in the face of scientific knowledge, and what he called a coherent understanding what he called the repressive amnesia. My view involved in Jung's perspective on these matters, which is provides a way tendency to reconcile to deliberately forget disagreeable memories, establishing a vision of the new age. That means we need to question the dubious and unscientific claims about the origins of the Christian Gospels, and instead treat the problem stories as moral parables with an enduring ethical meaning, rather than in the traditional way as evidence of supernatural intervention in the world. How we connect to reality. Now, the precession hypothesis that I'm presenting may be regarded by some as dubious perspectives that are grounded more in our emotional feelings. I suggest it has the advantage of being totally compatible with modern scientific knowledge and also explaining many things that are now quite mysterious. It needs to be the astrology of the age of Aquarius imagines the structure of nature, love, developed in modern cosmology, repair and unity. Quite a difficult an age of truth and justice, view of the centrality of miraculous and supernatural claims in religion. Major religious ideas about creation and salvation are not supported by empirical evidence. Jung sought to find meaning in religious beliefs as symbolic allegory. He read texts as parables for a scientific understanding. Astrology, as a result, he called on sign of Aquarius to acquire more humility in the face of scientific knowledge. To escape what he called the repressive amnesia involved in conventional faith, mystical, compassionate which is belief. The apologetic tendency so that means to deliberately forget disagreeable memories. From the age of Pisces, that means we need to question which is the dubious and unscientific astrological symbolism associated with that is a shift from belief to knowledge as moral parables of an enduring ethical meaning, rather than in the traditional way, as quite directly matches the real change in the social evolution of the gradual replacement of maybe religion by science as the dominant basis of social values. Next slide, please. A model of time that I suggest it should be seen as a way to integrate and reconcile, totally compatible with modern scientific knowledge, and also explaining many things that are now quite mysterious scientific. So now, the astrology the zodiac of age the age of Aquarius imagines a cycle of peace and love provide a framework to explain religious repair and unity. My view, an age of truth and justice, Christianity, harmony and understanding, symbolize and reflect it's rather like the Christian millennium, the zodiac imagined in the biblical stories in a way of the second coming of Jesus Christ. Toward and informs the current transition into a new age. So this claim offers a way to transform trajectory towards destruction will be reversed, putting faith onto scientific foundations of knowledge rather than belief. Again, pointing towards astrology, new paradigm. Traditionally says that the sign of Aquarius, the underlying astronomy of this material in some depth, and looking at how while the corresponding theme for the sign of Pisces equinox is understood as mystical, compassionate framework of the whole solar system. So that means that if you look at the shift from the age of Pisces now, but to the age of Aquarius, the science which is now happening, really then the astrological symbolism associated with that is a shift from belief to knowledge as the guiding theme of social values. Principle. Corresponds to this change quite directly matches the natural shifts in climate change, which indicate the social evolution of the gradual replacement driving long-term natural climate by science as the dominant basis of social values. Returning to that question, I'd like to explain a bit more about the links between the age of Aquarius as a way to integrate and reconcile reason and faith. So, if the age of Aquarius concept has value as an evolutionary model to imagine future planetary repair, and seeing the story of the second coming of Jesus Christ as a parable for the dawn of age of Aquarius that provide a framework to explain toward a scientific way to explain the conventional Christian mythology of the end times, symbolize and reflect the ancient understanding of the zodiac age can, in a way, that points toward and informs the current transformation into a new age. Which we would have so this claim offers a way to transform and renew Christian faith. Now, my view is the only way these scientific foundations of knowledge can make sense rather than belief is by finding a way to ground towards symbolic spirituality in science. I've studied the underlying astronomy of this material in some depth, and looking at how ancient knowledge of precession provided a religious framework to understand the orderly structure of time. The framework of the whole solar used this objective framework of cosmic order and direction. I won't have time to go into that, upon which the story of Jesus Christ was imagined and fleshed out. Is really quite interesting. So, looking at the astronomy area that can help us to how this idea of a social evolution from belief to knowledge, we've seen our zodiac principle corresponds to cosmic clock of history. The deep underlying this natural shifts in climate change from which indicate astronomy program phase of the orbital cycle 5. Driving long-term natural climate patterns. On a whirlwind tour before 7,000 years returning to that question, I'd like to explain a bit more about the links between the age of Aquarius BC and Christianity, which I believe Bishop Ussher suggested was the date of the creation of the universe. If the age of Aquarius concept has value as an evolutionary model to imagine future planetary repair of the equinox and at that time, seeing the story of the second coming of Jesus Christ as a parable for the dawn of age of Aquarius. The Milky Way look moving toward a scientific in between the constellations of conventional Christian mythology Taurus of the end times. Moving forward 1,000 years, we see that this scientific approach to zodiac age has shifted towards into Taurus, and then continuing sudden supernatural transformation, which we would have all seen in 3000 BC, shifted into Taurus, close to the Pleiades, the Hyades. My view, then next is to 2000 BC, religious ideas can we've reached the end of the age of Taurus by finding a way the start of the age of Aries. Symbolic spirituality then from 2000 BC and the astronomy of precession provides a powerful heuristic in the middle of the age of Aries to achieve this goal. At the BC ancient knowledge of precession just provided a religious framework to understand the orderly structure of time. Now, and the year New Testament AD used this objective framework of cosmic order and direction. There's a line of stars which is perpendicular to the path of the story of Jesus Christ, which is known as the first fish of Pisces. And so, looking at the astronomy that can help us to link this material to biblical analysis. So this we've seen that zodiac the precise moment of the shift of the equinox. So from the constellation of Aries that I've got here is into from the constellation of Pisces. Astronomy program. There are many ways of Skygazer 4.5 interpreting it, but my view is that the way the ancients understood it and predicted it for centuries before it happened, just through October their basic astronomical 1004 BC, which I believe Bishop Ussher suggested was the date of the creation of the universe. They understood that, but as the start of a new age. Some irony. Now, continuing, this is the 1000 AD of the equinox through the age of Pisces. At that time, 6,000 years ago, we see the path of the sun and the equator, and then we get back to the Milky Way, moving diagonally in between the constellations of Gemini and Taurus. Then, moving forward 1,000 years, we see that this X point, the equinox point, I'd just like to go back towards into Taurus and then to the sign of Pisces. And so just forward and and we'll just go forward one more. 3000 BC. Yeah, what we see here, I'm just going to explain one of the next to 2000 BC about we see my hypothesis that the ancients used this precession knowledge as a basis for Christian ideas, and that's the Christian symbol of the Chi-Rho cross as a major clue to astronomical influence on Christian origins. So this moment created an imaginary shape in the sky that's the same as the Chi-Rho cross. and with the same symbolism.
At that point, the chi or the x
the year
is created by
AD,
the intersection of the path of the sun and the equator, and the rho
there's a line
in
of stars
the
which is
cross,
perpendicular
like
to the
P,
path of the sun,
is created by the perpendicular
which
line
is
of
known
stars
as the
that form the
first
first
fish
of
of
Pisces.
Now, for the ancient procession theology, as I'm trying to reconstruct it, this moment marked an imagined celestial harmony between the stars and the seasons, the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It was a turning point of time, connecting heaven and earth, as above, so below, the shift
representing the incarnation of divine
from
reason
the constellation of
in
Aries
Jesus as the Son of God.
into the constellation
Physical
of Pisces.
observation marks the transition
there are many ways of
from the zodiac age of Aries
interpreting it, but my view is that
the age of
the way
Pisces,
the ancients understood
from
it,
one
and
great
predicted
year of
it
procession
for
to the
centuries
next.
before
The alpha and omega symbols that you can see here in the traditional Cairo cross reinforce this meaning of
when
Christ
the
as a
equinox
turning
moved
point,
across
the
this first
line.
fish,
So
they understood
the age
that
of Aries, the
as
first of the age of
the start
Pisces.
of a new age.
It was an event
Now,
that the seers
continuing
could foretell for centuries
to
beforehand
1000
through
AD,
relatively simple
through the age of
visual astronomy.
Pisces.
And
the equinox
in my view, it provides quite an elegant explanation of the prophecies of the advent and timing of Christ.
We get back
On
to
this
the
analysis, the gospel story
today
of Jesus of Nazareth
this year
emerged from much
and,
older religious
and then
observation of
finally
procession as the defining
in the
cosmic
middle
structure of history.
Aquarius,
Jesus was imagined from long before his incarnation, personifying the Sun as the founder or
I'd just like to go back
of
to
the
this
zodiac age
point
of Pisces,
when the equinox
is the
crossed
period now coming
into
to
the
an
sign
end.
of Pisces.
And on our next
And
slide, we
so
see
just
here
forward
Emperor Constantine
and,
in 312
and
AD
forward one
with his
more.
famous vision. Now, what we see here,
I'm
the
just
cross
going
in the
to
sky,
explain
just before the Battle of the
one
Milvian
of
Bridge,
these
which
forensic
produced
clues
the imperial
about
symbol known as the
my hypothesis that the ancients used this procession knowledge
as
Emperor
a basis
Constantine
for Christian
used
ideas,
this
and that's the Christian symbol of the
miraculous
Cairo
vision.
cross as a major
to
clue
identify
to
Christianity as a
astronomical
suitable
influence
story
on
to
Christian
bring the empire
origins.
together.
So
This moment
created
with
an imaginary shape in the sky
to dominate the
that's
world
the
for the next
same
1,000
as
years
the
and more.
Cairo cross. If the Cairo
And with the
cross
same symbolism.
was actually based
Chi or
on
the X
observation
is
of the
created
precession of
by
the equinox,
the intersection of
it
the
appears
path of the
that the
sun
church
and the equator
in the time of
and the
Constantine
rho
in the
must have
Cairo
still
cross,
held this
like a P,
astronomical knowledge,
is created by the
but for some
perpendicular
reason
line of stars that
they
form the
decided to
first
keep it
fish
a
of
secret.
Pisces.
And perhaps
Now, they
the
saw it
ancient
as too
procession
complex
theology,
and confusing
as I'm
for
trying to
public
reconstruct
knowledge.
it.
This preferred the literal dogma
an
of the
imagined
Gospels. Celestial harmony between the
Cairo
stars and the
symbol,
seasons,
together
the
with
incarnation
the
of Jesus Christ.
Ichthus Christian
It was
fish,
a turning point based on the imagery of
connecting
Pisces,
heaven
heaven and earth,
made
as
Christianity
above,
the
so
definitive
below,
religion of the new age.
representing the incarnation.
And it helps to
of
explain
divine
how
reason.
Jung
Jesus
saw
as the Son of God,
Christ
as the avatar of the age of
Physical
Pisces. Observation marks the transition
Observation
from
of the stars
the zodiac
provided
age
the
of
template
Aries for ancient philosophy and religion. With the visible heavens
age of
as the
Pisces.
symbol of orderly,
From one
eternal
great
perfection
year
of procession
A notable
to the
example
next.
comes from Plato, 400
The
years
alpha
before
and
Christ.
omega symbols that you can
recognised
see
this
here
moving X
in
in the
the
sky,
traditional Cairo
marked by the
cross
equinox.
reinforce
philosophical
this
dialogue
meaning
called
of
the
Timaeus,
Timaeus,
turning point as the
and
first and last.
he used it
So to describe
last of the
time
age of
as
Aries,
what he
before
calls
the
the
moving
age
image of
of
eternity.
Pisces.
Plato
It was an
recorded very
event
high
that the seers
significance
could
of this
foretell for
observation.
centuries beforehand.
He said that this X in the
relatively
sky
simple
was the
visual
basis of
astronomy.
his cosmology of the world
And
soul.
in my view, it
He said it
quite
was
an elegant
the
explanation
basis
of the
of
prophecies
the fundamental
of the
concepts
advent
and
and
logic
timing of Christ,
identity and difference.
On this analysis, the gospel
Now,
story
he didn't
of
present
Jesus of
an
Nazareth
accurate description of
emerged
procession
from
in the
much
Timaeus.
older religious observation
it's
of
still
procession
entirely possible
as
that
the
such
defining
accurate
cosmic
knowledge
structure
did
of
exist
history.
long before Plato's time.
Jesus was
and
imagined from
was only
long
known in
before
distorted form
his
in his
incarnation,
academy,
personifying the
that
Son
there was a
as the
deliberate
founder or
concealment
avatar
of the secret
zodiac
knowledge from the
age of
public.
Pisces, which
My
is
reading
the period now
indicates
coming
that
to an end.
observation of procession was of
And
major
on our
interest
next
to
slide,
the
we
writers
see
of the New
here
Testament.
Emperor Constantine
Although
in 312 AD.
the records of this interest were couched in deliberately concealed language, which indicates the existence of strong political opposition
produced
to making
the
it public.
imperial symbol known as
I'd like to explore some of the numerous examples of this hidden astronomy in the Bible.
cross.
It's quite a remarkable detective story.
Emperor Constantine
provides
used
important
this
contribution to understanding the meaning of the
miraculous
miraculous
vision
today. Now, as I mentioned,
to identify Christianity as a suitable story to bring the empire together.
Aries. And that establishing Christendom with a political ideology
no longer
that
true
was
at the
to
time
dominate
of
the world
for the next 1,000 years and more.
In the year 5
Cairo
BC,
cross
as
was
Jewish
actually
people came
based
to Jerusalem from all
on
around
observation
Israel
of the
to
procession
celebrate
of
the
the
Passover
equinox.
feast. They
It
saw
appears
a very
that the church
unusual sight
in the time of
heavens.
Constantine
The Jewish
must have
lunar
still
calendar
held
sets the date
this
of Passover
astronomical knowledge,
near the first full
but for
moon
some
after the spring
reason
equinox.
they decided to keep it a secret,
like Easter
and
for
perhaps they
Christianity.
saw it as
In
too
5
complex
BC,
and confusing for
Passover
public knowledge.
and
They preferred the literal dogma of the
in
Gospels.
5 BC,
Passover coincided
Cairo
with a
symbol,
blood moon,
together with
a total
the
lunar eclipse.
ichthus Christian fish,
Quite like the
based
one
on the imagery
Hipparchus
of
had seen a
Pisces,
century before.
made Christianity the definitive religion of the New
revealed
Age.
by both of these eclipses
And it helps to
was that
explain
the heavens
how,
had shifted
Jung
from the stellar
saw,
axis that had held
Christ
since the
as
time
the
of
avatar
since
of the
before
age
the
of
time of
Christ.
Moses. When the Passover sun was
Observation
in
of the
Aries,
stars
the full
provided the
moon
template
had to be in the
for
opposite
ancient
constellation,
philosophy
which
and
is
religion.
Libra.
With the visible
But
heavens as the symbol
everyone in
of
Jerusalem on
worldly
this night
eternal
of
perfection.
Passover could see
A notable
that the
example
full
comes
moon
from
was
Plato,
not in Libra,
400 years
and
before Christ.
the exact spot
He
of the full moon
recognised
was
this
shown by
moving
the time it
X in
went
the
blood
sky,
red. You can tell that it's
marked by the
directly lined up.
equinox. In his
It was in the next
philosophical
star
dialogue
group,
called
Virgo,
Timaeus,
at a point that we can call at the foot of the woman.
used it to describe
That meant the
time
sun was
as
not in
what
its
he called the
traditional
moving
Passover
image of
location of
eternity.
Aries, but had
Plato
processed
accorded very
into the
high
constellation of
significance to
Pisces.
this
And you can
observation.
see this equinox axis.
He said that this X in the
A new
sky
age
was the basis
the
of
Roman
his
world was
cosmology
moving
of the world
into what
soul.
we now call the common era.
He said
uniting
it was
previously
the
separate
basis
nations.
of the fundamental
Christianity had
concepts in
come
logic
to celebrate this
of
moment
identity
as the
and
turning
difference.
point of time.
Marking
Now,
the
he
incarnation of
didn't
Jesus
present
Christ.
an
And
accurate
the
description
underlying
of procession
basis for
in the
this
Timaeus. And for
But
our
it's
BC
still entirely
AD
possible
calendar dating
that
system,
such accurate knowledge
this
did exist
visible
long
movement of the
before
stellar
Plato's
point,
time,
where the natural year
and
begins.
was
The
only
reason
known
I
in
mentioned this
distorted
observation
form
of
in
this
his
lunar
academy,
eclipse,
or
its
striking
there was
similarity
a
to the
deliberate
text from
concealment
Revelation 12
of the
Verse
secret
1
knowledge
says,
from
"A
the
great
public.
sign appeared in heaven.
A woman
reading
with the moon
indicates
under her
that
feet.
observation of procession was of
This
major interest
cryptic
to the writers of the New
image
Testament.
exactly matches
Although
this great sign that appeared in heaven
the
at
records
Passover in 5
of this
BC,
interest
when
were
the full moon
couched
at the foot
in
of Virgo
deliberately
marked the dawning of a new
concealed
age, with the
which indicates
equinoxes
the
shifting
existence of
to the
strong
Virgo-Pisces
political
axis.
opposition to making it
Virgo
public.
and Pisces
I'd
also
like to explore
symbolise
some of
the
the numerous
loaves and
examples
fishes.
of this hidden
The
astronomy
brightest star in
the
Virgo
Bible.
is Spica,
It's quite
which
a
comes from
remarkable detective
the
story
spike of wheat.
that provides an important
It's another biblical theme that directly
the age
encodes
Aquarius
this
today.
procession cosmology.
Now,
As
I
I
mentioned,
mentioned, of the creation of universal abundance through harmony with the
sun in
cosmos.
Aries. And that
This
has certainly been true
astronomical
2,000 years.
interpretation of these texts
It was no
but
longer
they appear to be
true
entirely
at the
new.
time of Christ.
But
its
simplicity,
year
its
5
coherence
BC
suggests it may
as
also
the
it may
Jewish
in
people
fact be
came
really
to Jerusalem
very
from
old
all around Israel
and was somehow lost
to celebrate the Passover
It
feast.
points to an
They
accurate
saw
cosmology
a very
behind the New Testament.
unusual sight
In
the
Jesus
heavens,
in which Jesus
the
Christ
Jewish
was imagined
lunar
as the
calendar
avatar
sets
of the
date
zodiac age of
Passover
Pisces, near the
and
first
also
full moon after the
of the
spring
zodiac
equinox,
age of Aquarius,
quite in the second coming,
like Easter for
Christian
Christianity.
theology.
In
My
5
view is that the
BC,
zodiac age model
Passover
can put biblical
and-
cosmology onto a scientific basis,
showing that many
in 5 BC, Passover coincided with a blood moon,
and simply
a total lunar
knowledge
eclipse.
of procession.
This quite like the
Observation
one
has
Hipparchus had
major
seen a
implications
century
for
before.
ethical
But
messages
the
in the
disconcerting thing
scientific
revealed by
practical
both of these eclipses
foundation
was that the heavens had shifted from the stellar axis
Placing
that
Christian
had held
mythology
since before the time of Moses.
visual
When the Passover sun was in
complex order of
Aries,
human
the
existence
full moon had to be
as
in
a
the
basis
opposite
to build a
constellation,
vision of our
which
common
is
future,
Libra.
grounded in the wisdom of
But everyone in
My
Jerusalem on
hypothesis
this night
is
of
that knowledge
Passover
of
could
procession
see
provided
that the
the
full
real
moon was
original
not in Libra,
basis of Christian
and
theology.
the exact spot of the
the
full moon
story
was
of
shown by
Christ
the time it went
designed
blood red.
to
You can
directly
tell that it's
reflect the
directly lined
grand
up.
order seen
It was
in the
in the
heavens
next star group,
to
Virgo,
reflect this order on
at a
earth,
point that we can
viewing the
call
glory
at
of the starry
woman.
firmament as
That
the
meant
primary
the sun was
manifestation
not
of the
in its
power and presence
traditional
of God,
Passover
as
location
St.
of
Paul
Aries,
suggests in
but
Romans
had
1:20.
processed into the constellation of
this astronomical foundation was systematically suppressed, ignored, forgotten, and denied by the Church
The Roman world
due
was
to its
moving
perceived
into what we now call the common
incompatibility
era, uniting
with Orthodox
previously
literal
separate
belief.
nations.
The imperial
Christianity
Church
would come
required
to celebrate this
simple
moment
doctrines,
as the turning
and
point
it
of time,
declared an anathema
marking the
against
incarnation of
any
Jesus Christ.
so-called heresy.
And the underlying basis for this belief and for our BC AD calendar dating system was this visible movement of the stellar point where the natural year begins. The reason I mention this observation of this lunar eclipse is its striking similarity to the text from Revelation 12. Verse 1 says, "A great sign appeared in heaven."
So the imperial church required simple doctrines that everyone could understand. It declared anathema against so-called heresies that made the faith too complex and confusing for the ignorant masses.
When the full moon at the foot of
The
Virgo
origins of
marked the
Christianity
dawning of a new age,
thereby became
with
lost
the
to view.
equinoxes shifting.
It's like
to the Virgo
scaffolding
Pisces
that you
axis.
remove once a building is complete.
Virgo and Pisces,
This theological
also
framework of
symbolise
cosmic symbolism in the
loaves
Bible
and fishes.
supports
The
my
bright
view
star
that the
in
construction
Virgo
of a new
is
vision for the
Spica,
age of
which comes from the
Aquarius
the
should
spike of
become the
wheat.
central organising idea
It's another
for a
biblical
transformed
theme
and contemporary
that
Christian
directly
faith
encodes
looking to
this
reform
procession
Christianity to make it
cosmology
fully compatible
as a symbol
with scientific
of
knowledge.
the creation of universal abundance.
Another
harmony with the
example
cosmos.
of this mysterious concealment of
This
procession in the Bible
astronomical
comes from the book of Revelation, with
may appear to be
the
entirely
infamous
new,
first beast
but
of the apocalypse.
its simplicity, its coherence,
forward to the next
suggests
slide.
it may also,
see
it may
here
in fact
North
be
Celestial
really
Pole,
very
with
old,
where
and was
Polaris
somehow
is the
lost.
northern pole star.
It points
It's
to
generally
an
regarded
accurate
as an unchanging
cosmology
feature of
behind
the
the New
heavens,
Testament,
never moving
in
from its
Jesus
position
was
at the North
in which
Celestial
Jesus
Pole.
Christ was imagined as
At least
the
that's how
avatar
it
of the
seems
zodiac
to each
age of
generation in
Pisces.
modern times.
And also,
Of the
Polaris
zodiac
is the
age
bright
of
star at the
Aquarius
tail of
in the
the
second
bear.
coming. Ursa Minor.
Christian theology,
And it's popularly
my view
known as
is
the
that
Little
the
Dipper.
zodiac age
Sailors
model
have used it for
can
centuries
put
to find
biblical
biblical cosmology
several
onto a
thousand years ago,
scientific basis.
when the ideas in the
Jung
Bible were being
many
developed.
biblical images
Polaris was a long
like
way
this
from the pole,
mysterious
woman in heaven,
which was then in the
directly
constellation
and
of
simply
Draco,
encode
on
knowledge
shown
of
on the next
precession.
slide.
This
Near
observation
near the
has
bright
major
star of
implications
Thuban
for
and
core ethical
I'm
messages
sorry,
in the
I've
Bible.
changed the frame of
The
reference.
scientific frame of reference is the
North
ecliptic pole,
Foundation, which is the pole of the sun. The celestial pole is the pole of the earth.
placing the Christian mythology
Astronomy. But anyway, we're talking about the movement structure of the North Celestial
visual
Pole
astronomy.
and to describe the complex order of human existence.
Polaris
As
has
it
moved
moves
its
to build a
position in the
vision of
sky
our common future,
to become the pole
grounded
star
in the wisdom
as a
of the
result of the
past.
same slow wobble of the Earth's
My
axis
hypothesis
that caused the
is
equinox
that
points to
knowledge of
process around the
precession
stars of the
provided
zodiac.
the real
One of
original
the strangest
basis
stories,
of
as I
Christian
mentioned,
theology.
is in Revelation 13,
The
where the
story
dragon
of Christ
gave his power, his
designed
seat,
to
and his
directly
authority
reflect the
to
grand
leopard
order
bear
seen
lion.
in the
This
heavens.
weird image of the beast
To
of the
reflect
apocalypse
this order on
is
earth,
quite hallucinatory.
viewing the glory
But
of the starry
observation of
firmament
these stars near
as the
pole
primary manifestation of the
readily
power
show
and
a
presence of
probable
God,
real meaning.
as St. Paul suggests in
Power and
Romans
seat and
1:20.
authority of the visible
However,
heavens traditionally
this
rests at the
astronomical
North Celestial
foundation
Pole,
was systematically
which is the fixed
suppressed,
point
ignored,
around which the whole
forgotten,
sky
and denied
revolves every
by the
night.
Church
There
due
are
to its
numerous
perceived
myths that liken the celestial
incompatibility
pole to the throne
with
of God.
Orthodox literal belief.
Before 2000
The
BC,
imperial church
the
required
pole was in Draco the
simple
dragon,
doctrines,
and since then,
and it
the pole
declared
has slowly
an
shifted
anathema
into the
against
constellation
any
of the
so-called
bear,
heresy.
right next to the constellation of Leo the lion, and others with names that are based on the leopard. So, the authors of the Revelation could see that this cosmic movement of the pole against the stars reflected the big historical story of deep time as the encompassing measure of history. For the dragon to give his power, seat, and authority to the leopard bear lion,
So the imperial
therefore
church
reads as a
required
direct
simple
allegory
doctrines
for this
that everyone
observation
could
of
understand.
cosmic order.
It
the procession
declared
of the
anathema
pole.
against so-called
For
heresies
the general public,
that
the
made
authors
the
packaged
faith
this
too
observation
complex
into the
and
supernatural
confusing
myth that we can
for
read
the
in the
ignorant
Bible.
masses.
But for the ancient
The origins
initiates,
of
the
Christianity
public story was
thereby
a code
became lost
for
to
accurate
view.
long-term observation
It's like
of the
scaffolding
orderly movement of the
that you
heavens.
remove once
This
a building is complete.
interpretation reflects the widespread
This
ancient
theological
practice
framework of
using
cosmic
public
symbolism in the
stories
Bible
to present a
supports
simplified
my
symbolic
view that the
version of
construction of a
concealed
new
knowledge,
vision for the age of
while the real
Aquarius
story was
should
retained
become
in
the
secret
central
shared
organising
oral
idea
memory
for a transformed
community
and
elders,
contemporary Christian
rather
faith,
not in writing.
looking to reform
This
Christianity,
interpretation
make it
provides
fully compatible
intriguing
with
questions
scientific knowledge.
as to why the authors might have found the need to conceal their real
another
meaning,
example
and
of this
why
mysterious
this
mode of
concealment of
interpretation
procession
in
was
the
so
Bible
comprehensively lost
comes from,
to public
again,
view.
from the book of
The
Revelation,
answer may be
with
that
the
Orthodox
infamous
religion
first
saw
beast of
this
the
stellar
apocalypse
symbolism as detracting from its stories
move
of the
forward to the
transcendental
next
dignity of God.
You see here
The result of this
the North
repressive
Celestial
culture
Pole,
was that such
where
symbols could
Polaris
only be
is the
conveyed
northern
in
pole
concealed
star.
form,
It's generally
making them
regarded as an
highly
unchanging
vulnerable
feature of the
to
heavens,
complete suppression
never moving
of their
from
real
its
meaning.
position at the North Celestial
Now,
Pole.
equally simple,
At least that's how it seems to each generation in modern times.
applies to biblical
Polaris
language
is the
about
bright
Holy
star
City,
at the tail of the tree of life,
the river
Ursa
of
Minor,
life, the cleansing of the
and it's
temple by
popularly
Christ,
known as the Little Dipper.
the end
Sailors
of the
have
age,
used it for
the first
centuries
and
to
the
find
last,
north.
but
The
several
upper
thousand
room,
years ago,
the second
when the
coming,
ideas in the Bible
the lamb
were
and
being
fish.
developed, symbols for Christ,
Polaris was a long way
King
from
of
the
Ages,
pole,
the
which
wheat
was
and
then
tares,
in the
and
constellation
the miracle
of Draco,
the loaves and fishes,
shown on the next slide.
Such extensive
Here,
usage, with its
the
match
bright
to an
star
entirely
of Thuban,
consistent and elegant natural meaning,
sorry,
I've
cannot
changed
be
the frame
simply
of
dismissed
reference.
as
This
imagination
frame of reference
or
is
coincidence.
the North ecliptic pole,
The real puzzle
which is the pole of the
is
sun,
the scale and
the celestial
success
pole
of
is
the
pole of
psychological
Earth,
and
which
political
is a rather
repression
complex astronomy,
that were
but anyway, we're
required to
talking about the
conceal
movement
this
of
material,
the North celestial
with its
pole.
indication of the
And,
degraded state of human consciousness and our propensity to
Polaris
believe in
has
myths.
moved its position in the sky.
The gospel story of the
become the
Last
pole
Supper
star
is a key
as a
procession
result of the
parable for the
same
age of
slow
Aquarius.
wobble of the Earth's
The upper
axis
room where
that
Jesus
caused
ate
the
his final
equinox
meal
points to
is a
process
symbol
around
of
the stars of the
eternal
zodiac.
glory and power
One of the
God.
strangest stories,
Manifest
as I
in the
mentioned,
visible
is
starry
in
heavens
Revelation
of the night
13,
sky.
where the dragon
Jesus tells
gave
his
his
disciples
power, his
in
seat,
Gospels
and his
Mark and
authority
Luke,
to
to
the
the
man
leopard
carrying a
bear
water jug
lion.
will show their way
This
to the
weird
upper room.
image of the beast of the
Reading
apocalypse
this story
is
as an
quite
allegory for the age of
hallucinatory,
Aquarius,
but observation
man
of
with
these
the jug
stars near the
symbolises
pole
the sign of the
readily
water-bearer.
show a probable real meaning.
And
Here we
power and seat and authority of the visible heavens traditionally
we'll move
rests
forward to the
at
next
the
one.
North Celestial Pole, which is the fixed point around which the
So,
whole sky revolves
the man
every
with the
night.
jug symbolises the sign of the
There are
water-bearer.
numerous
My reading
myths
sees
that
this
liken
as an
the celestial
expectation
pole to the
that
throne
the
of
stellar
God.
basis of biblical
Before
symbolism
2000
would remain
BC,
concealed until the end of the
pole
age
was
of
in
Pisces
Draco the
and
dragon,
the dawn of the
and
age of
since
Aquarius.
then, the pole has slowly shifted
This
into the
appears
constellation
to indicate the ancient
bear,
authors
right
believed
next
that
to
the public
the
consciousness of
constellation
their
of Leo
day
the
was
lion,
too ignorant,
and
too degraded,
others
too
with
supernatural
names that
to
are based
engage
on
this
the
high
leopard.
stellar wisdom of procession.
So,
This
the
stellar
authors of the
code in the Last
Revelation
Supper supports
could
the
see
idea
that
that the Gospels
cosmic
present
movement
Jesus
of the
as an
pole
allegory for the
against
sun,
the stars,
with the 12
reflected
disciples
the big
as allegory for the 12
historical
lunar time, lunar months,
as
and the signs of the
encompassing
zodiac.
measure of history,
As the light
for
of
the
the
dragon
world,
to give
in
his
Gospel of
power,
John,
seat, and authority
Jesus
to the
shone
leopard
as
bear
brightly as
lion,
the sun.
therefore reads as a
radiant
direct
image of Christ
allegory
as a
for this
personification of the
observation
sun
of cosmic
coheres
order,
perfectly with the procession
pole.
hypothesis, since it's the
To the
position
general
of the sun
public,
that
the
defines
authors
the zodiac
packaged
ages.
this observation into
Now,
the supernatural
this
myth
astral
that we can
model of
read
the
in the
upper
Bible.
room,
Just going back
but
to
for the ancient
slide, please.
initiates, the public
Is-
story was a
it's not a
code
sensible
for
speculation.
accurate
And
long-term
in fact,
observation
as
of
you
the
might
orderly
recall,
movement of the
I've
heavens.
argued it was supported by one of the greatest
This
geniuses,
interpretation
Leonardo da
reflects the
Vinci.
widespread ancient
As I
practice
explained in my
of
address last
using
year,
public stories.
There's a remarkable
present a
instance of
simplified
Pisces Christ
symbolic version
allegory
of concealed
hidden
knowledge,
in plain sight,
while the
in
real
Leonardo's
story
Last Supper,
was retained
with
in
Jesus
secret shared
directly
oral
modelled
memory
on the constellation
by
of Pisces,
community elders,
reflecting his
rather
symbolic
not in
role
writing.
as avatar
This
of the zodiac
interpretation
age of Pisces.
provides intriguing
And similarly,
questions
the 12 apostles
as to why the
are
authors
directly
might have
modelled in
found the
order
need
from
to
right to left
conceal their real
on the stars
meaning,
of the zodiac.
and why this
Postures
mode
of
of
each
interpretation
apostle are the
was
same
so
shapes as the
comprehensively
main stars
lost
of the actual
to public
zodiac
view.
constellations
The
in
answer
the
may
same
be
order as in the
that
sky.
Orthodox
From
religion saw this
This
stellar
reflects
symbolism
Leonardo's
as
core
detracting from its
stories
stories
of the
artfully
transcendental
concealed
dignity of
to
God.
respect religious prejudice.
The result of this repressive culture
Now,
was that such
with this
symbols
hypothesis
could
that
only be
observation
conveyed
of
in
procession
concealed
was
form,
central to Christian
making
origins.
them highly vulnerable.
It
to
structures the
complete
formation
suppression
of core
of their
Christian
real
ideas
meaning.
by grounding the story
Now,
of how
equally
God orders the
simple
cosmos. Analysis of star
The
symbolism
literal
and the
gospel
cosmology
story
of
directly
procession
reflects this
applies
archetypal
to
symbolism
biblical
of Jesus
language
as a
about
solid
the
deity. holy city,
It suggests
life,
that a secret wisdom school was responsible for the ideas
the cleansing of the temple by Christ,
as a way to put cosmic ideas of glory and order, the first and the last. This community
could have been
the second coming,
the
lamb and fish near Alexandria in Egypt, the king of ages, influenced
the wheat and
strongly by
tares,
Buddhism, and the miracle
the implications
of loaves and fishes
of the procession
among
parables,
others, such as the man with the water jug.
extensive usage with its match
To an
the
entirely
original authors
consistent
developed a
and
sophisticated
elegant
vision of the
natural
shape
meaning
of world history,
cannot be simply
which
dismissed as
the Christian
imagination
message
or
will be widely
coincidence.
spread in distorted form.
The real puzzle
through the 2 millennia
is the
of the age
scale
of
and
Pisces.
success of the psychological
Then
and
finally
political
be properly
repression
understood as a
that were
program for
required to
planetary
conceal
transformation,
this material,
opening the age of
with
Aquarius
its indication of
as
the
a time of
degraded
planetary
state of
repair
human
and
consciousness
restoration,
and our
imagined as the
propensity
Sabbath
to believe
millennium
in
of
myths.
peace. And
The gospel story of the Last Supper is a key procession parable for the age of Aquarius.
biblical understanding of
The upper
history
room where Jesus
offers
ate
quite
his
an
final
intriguing
meal
comparison here.
is a symbol
So,
for the
Bible
eternal
texts
glory and
state
power
that
of God,
1,000 years are like a day
manifest
for God.
in the visible starry
And
heavens
the early
of the night
Christian
sky.
writers read
Jesus
this to
tells
imply
his
a
disciples
7,000-year
in
theory
the
of
Gospels
history
of Mark and
from
Luke
about 4000
that
BC
a
to
man
3000
carrying
AD
a water jug will show their
6,000
way
years of
to the
fall,
upper room.
followed by 1,000 years
Reading
of
this
repair,
story as an
modelled on
allegory
the 7
for the
days
age
of
of
creation
Aquarius,
described in Genesis,
the man
where
with
God
the jug
works for 6 days and
symbolises
then
the
rests
sign
for a day.
of the water bearer.
This day millennium theory supports the belief that the
see-
second coming of Christ would occur at the beginning of the current millennium, starting the 7th millennium of history. So, the Genesis idea of the 7th day as a Sabbath day of rest,
The man with the jug
therefore
symbolises the
coheres
sign
with
of the
New
water
Age
bearer.
idea
My
of the
reading
age of
sees
Aquarius
this as an
as a time of
expectation
planetary peace and
that the
repair.
stellar basis of biblical symbolism would
Popular
remain
stories in the
concealed
Christian Gospels
until the end of the age
aimed
of
to create the
Pisces
impression
and the dawn of the age of
events they
Aquarius.
describe literally occurred. But modern
This
research has shown
appears
that the
to
authors
indicate
wrote
the
these
ancient
stories
authors
as moral parables,
believed that the public
as historical
consciousness
fiction,
of their day
drawing loosely
was
from
too
history and
ignorant,
myth.
too
The
degraded,
real
too
primary meaning of
supernatural
all the stories
to
in the Bible,
engage this high
including the
stellar
life of
wisdom
Jesus,
of procession.
is found in
This
how they
stellar
symbolise
code in the
real
Last
natural
Supper
observations
supports
in a
that the
mythological
idea
framework.
that the Gospels
Any
present
match to
Jesus
actual
as an
events is
allegory for the
entirely
Sun,
secondary,
with the 12
even irrelevant
disciples
to
as
the high
allegory for the
religious
12
purpose
lunar
of enabling an
months
integrated vision
and the
of
signs
reality.
of the zodiac. As the
fact,
light of
I
the
would
world,
suggest
in
that the
Gospel of
dogmatic
John,
belief that the gospel
Jesus
stories are
shone as
literally
brightly
true as the sun
is actually quite deeply
the
corrupt.
radiant image of Christ
reflecting
as
this
a
long
personification of the
subordination
sun
of spiritual wisdom
coheres perfectly
beneath
with the
the
political
procession
stability
hypothesis
agenda of the Roman
since
Empire
it's the position
and its
of the
successors
sun
in Christendom
that defines the zodiac ages.
Getting behind the
Now,
surface appearance,
this
to find
astral model
the
of the
concealed
upper
truth,
room is
just
a
going
problem
back to
that the
previous
authors of the
slide, please,
Gospels approach through the philosophy of Plato.
It's not a
Who
fanciful
recognise that
speculation,
popular beliefs
and in
can
fact,
often serve as a cover
you might
for hidden
recall,
knowledge.
I've argued it was
Plato
supported
tells
by
the
one of
story
the
in the
greatest
Republic
geniuses of how
Leonardo da
philosopher
Vinci,
kings could construct
as
a
I
simplified
explained in
moral
my address
mythology
last
for
year
mass consumption.
There's
Plato
a
used as his
remarkable
example
instance of
such
Pisces
a
Christ
popular
allegory
political story,
hidden
a myth
in
based
plain
on
sight in
historical
Leonardo's
belief
Last Supper,
in descent from a
with
golden age
Jesus
of peace and abundance
directly modelled
to an
on
iron
the
age
constellation
of
of
war and
Pisces,
scarcity,
reflecting his symbolic
Plato's ideas
about
as
constructing a myth of the
avatar
golden
of the
age,
zodiac age of Pisces.
proved
And
highly
similarly, the
influential
12
for Christianity
apostles
in ways
are
that have not
directly
really been
modelled in
recognised.
order from right to left on the stars of the zodiac.
Now, the intellectual scaffolding
Postures of
provided
each
by the cosmic
apostle
story of
are the
procession of
same
equinox
shapes as the main stars of the actual
seems to have
zodiac
enabled
constellations
the construction
in
of
the
the
same
Christ
order
story.
as in the sky.
This building
Varies
framework
to
from the
Pisces.
stars was
This reflects
used to
Leonardo's
imagine
core
the timing
interest
and
in
nature
accurate
of a coming
depiction
new
of nature,
age.
artfully
From this highly
concealed to
distinctive
respect
observation of
religious
when the spring
prejudice.
point would move across the line of stars to enter Pisces.
With this
And
hypothesis,
the problem
of
was that this
observation
original
of
scaffolding
procession
was demolished
was
and discarded
to
once the
Christian
new myths
origins.
were established, just as
It
scaffolding
structures
platforms
the
are around
formation
a
of
real
core
building.
Christian ideas by grounding the story of how
Allowing
God orders
the actual
cosmos.
stellar template to be generally known,
The literal
would
gospel
undermine
story
the
directly
propaganda
reflects
objective of
this
gospel truth,
archetypal
and
symbolism
therefore
of
had to be
Jesus as a
vigorously
solid
suppressed.
deity.
It suggests that a secret wisdom school was responsible for the
like
ideas
to
in the New Testament.
As a way to put cosmic ideas of
Conclude
glory
with
and
some
order
information
into
about
a human setting, procession
this
and
community
climate change.
Could have been the therapeutes of the
So,
Lake Mariotis Monastery near Alexandria in Egypt, and influenced strongly by Buddhism. The implication of the procession parables, such as the man with the water jug.
So, Now, that the original this model of time that I've presented
vision
is
of the shape
by
of world history,
the science of precession,
in which
the Christian message would be widely spread in distorted form.
orbital
Through the
patterns
two
known as
millennia of
Milankovitch
the age of
cycles
Pisces show that precession was the
would
main
then
cause, finally be
rise
properly
and fall of
understood
sea levels
as a program
and
for
the advance
planetary
and retreat of
transformation,
glaciers,
opening the age of Aquarius,
the Pleistocene,
as a time of
planetary
planetary
combined
repair
with
and
other orbital cycles
restoration,
to produce a
imagined as
regular
the
cycle of
millennium
planetary
of
warming and
peace
cooling.
and
The
it's a cycle that quite intriguingly
conventional
matches directly
biblical understanding
to
of history
the Indian mythology of the
offers
Yuga
quite an
cycle
intriguing
between
comparison
golden
here.
ages and iron ages every
Bible
24,000
texts
years.
state that 1,000
On
years are like a day
Indian
for
myth,
God.
we're now
and
entering
the early
an
Christian
ascending writers read this to
which
imply
again
a
is a
7,000-year theory of history
directly corresponds
from
to
about
both
4,000
the story
BC
of
to
the age of
3,000
Aquarius
AD and the Christian idea
6,000 years
of
of
fall, followed by
planetary
1,000 years
salvation.
of repair, modelled
So,
on the 7 days of
to
creation
conclude,
described in Genesis. Where
tonight
God
I've
works
explained
6 days and then
how we can
rests
use
for a
the
day.
astronomy
Of precession
this
of the equinox
day millennium
to
theory
construct a systematic
supports
understanding of
the
the
belief
connection
that
between
the
our
second
planet
coming
and the
of
cosmos
Christ
would occur at the
at a
beginning
scale
of the current
directly
millennium,
relevant to human history
starting the
ethics.
7th millennium of history. Discussion of the coming new
So,
age of Aquarius,
the Genesis idea
provides a way to understand the forces
Sabbath
of
day of
good
rest,
and evil operating in our
therefore
world, coheres
as a
with
way
the new age
to
idea
marshal
of the
support
age of
for
Aquarius,
aimed
as a time
to
of planetary
enable
peace and
long-term
repair, flourishing of humanity within our natural planetary environment.
popular stories in the
Through
Christian
integration of
Gospels
science and
aimed
spirituality,
to
create the impression,
building
upon the
events
long
they
heritage
describe
of wisdom
literally occurred.
contained within the
But
diverse
modern
traditions
research is
of human
showing
culture.
that
The authors wrote these stories as moral parables, as historical fiction, drawing loosely from history and myth. The real primary meaning of
See
all
what
the
he's up
stories
to.
in the Bible, including the
Okay,
life
we're
of
back on.
Jesus,
We're back on. We better
is
stop.
found
back on.
in how they
Okay.
symbolize
All right, well,
real natural
welcome back.
observations
We'll just,
in a mythological
I know
framework.
there's
Any
a
match
lot to
to
take in,
actual
some
events
quite
is entirely
complex,
secondary,
perhaps even controversial
even
material there,
irrelevant
so
to the
I'd,
high
just
religious
encourage,
purpose
uh,
of enabling an
questions and
integrated
comments.
vision of reality.
Over to you.
In fact, I would suggest that the dogmatic belief that the gospel stories are literally true
Just a sec, what we'll do
is actually quite
is I'll
deeply
just
corrupt,
arrange with
reflecting this long
visual
subordination of
to
spiritual
find a
wisdom
microphone.
beneath the political stability agenda of the Roman Empire and its successors in
Okay,
Christendom.
so we do have a second
Getting
microphone,
behind the
which
surface appearance
Robert will bring
to
to you,
find
which you can
the
use
concealed
so that
truth
your
is a problem
question
that the
is-
authors
No,
of
we're
the
not.
Gospels approach through the philosophy
This
of
mic doesn't
Plato.
amplify.
We recognise that popular beliefs can often serve as a cover for hidden knowledge.
Robert,
Plato
outstanding,
tells the story in the Republic
unsurprisingly. Thank you so
how
much.
philosopher
So
kings
I'm fascinated
construct
by your
simplified
suggestion
moral
that we are
mythology
going
for
to
mass consumption.
merge religion
Plato used
with
as his
scientific
example of
knowledge.
such a popular political
What is going to
story,
be the
a
force
myth
which allows
based on
that
the
to happen? Is
historical
it going
belief
to be
in descent from a golden
human
age of peace and
intervention,
abundance
or
to an
is it
iron
going
age
to
of
be
war and scarcity?
the force of Aquarius, or is
Plato's
it going to
ideas
be
about constructing a
godlike
myth of the
and
golden
completely
age
beyond our comprehension and influence?
proved highly influential
I
for
see it
Christianity
as,
in ways that have not
I
really
see
been
religion as a
recognised.
construction of human culture.
Now,
And,
the
so
intellectual scaffolding
changes
provided by the
to
cosmic story
religion
of precession of the equinox
driven by
seems to have
underlying,
enabled the construction of the
social and
Christ
economic
story.
forces. And
This
then
building
people
framework
who
from the
emerge
stars
who
was
articulate
used to imagine the timing and
message
nature
that
of a
aligns
coming
with
new
those
age.
emerging.
From this highly
So
distinctive
really
observation of when the spring point would move across the line of stars
situation we face
to enter
is
Pisces.
one of globalization.
And the
That
problem
is,
was that this
the
original
human
scaffolding was
community
demolished
has,
and discarded
finally
once the
become
new
one.
myths
And
were
the
established,
story which,
just as
appears
scaffolding
directly in the
platforms
Bible,
are
Matthew
around a real
24,
building.
says that the end of the age will not come until
Allowing
this gospel
the
of
actual
kingdom
stellar
has been
template
preached
to be
to the whole
generally
inhabited
known
earth.
would have
And my
undermined
interpretation
the
of
propaganda
that
objective of
is,
gospel truth,
not in any
and therefore had to be
detailed
vigorously
sense,
suppressed.
but just that everybody on the planet will have had the opportunity to have heard of Jesus Christ.
I'd like to
And I think that that's the case now. Like even the most remote,
conclude with some
parts
information
of
about
the world, people know
precession
that there's
and
religions
climate
within Christianity.
change.
And so,
So,
finally, the whole of humanity is
this-
together. And I think there was a similar sort of force
Right,
in the ancient
okay.
world, which was the Common Era. That is,
Yeah,
that before the Greek and Roman invasions, people were able
So,
to maintained their
Now,
national religion.
this
in
model of
isolation.
time that
But
I've
once they were
presented
part of an
is
empire,
supported by
they needed to have
the science
a new
of precession
religion
as
which,
a primary driver
spoke
of
to
natural
that
climate
new,
change.
cross-cultural identity.
Orbital
So-
patterns
so
known
we're
as
now
Milankovitch
in a situation
cycles
of globalization,
show that precession
and
was the main
the
cause
key
of the
message
rise and fall of sea levels
in the
and the
gospel
advance and retreat
is
of glaciers
that
over the last
the
3 million years, the
salvation of the
Pleistocene.
world depends
Precession
on
combined
feeding
with
the
other
hungry
orbital cycles
and, giving
to produce a regular cycle
drink
of
to the
planetary
thirsty
warming and cooling.
and visiting
And
sick people, visiting prisoners.
it's a
welcoming
cycle
strangers,
that quite intriguingly matches
clothes and
directly
naked,
to
the
the
seventh,
Indian mythology of the
work
Yuga
of
cycle
is to
between
treat
golden
the rest of the
ages
world as
and
though
iron
Jesus
ages
Christ.
every
So
24,000
that's the
years.
story of the Bible
On the
about
Indian
message
myth,
of salvation,
we're now
and
entering
it's
an
one that's
ascending
been,
period,
really
which
quite badly
again is a
neglected
symbolism
within
that
Christianity.
directly corresponds to
And
both
yet
the
it's
story
one
of
that
the
I
age of
think
Aquarius
speaks to
and the
the
Christian
sort of
idea
emerging
of
forces
of
the
planetary
need for
salvation.
global stability.
So, to conclude,
Thank you.
this tonight I've explained how we can use the astronomy of
Terry?
precession of the equinox to construct a systematic understanding of the connection
But
between
just
our
Terry,
planet
before you
and the
speak, were you going
cosmos
to
at a scale
ask the
directly
question?
relevant
Okay,
to
after-
human
after
history
Terry,
and
thanks.
ethics.
Thanks.
Discussion of the coming new
Thanks
age of
very much.
Aquarius
Robert, is that working or
provides a
not?
way to understand the forces of good and evil
One of the questions
operating
that
in our
you
world.
raised, more of
As a way
a mystery, is
to
that
marshal support for ideas
why did the church
aimed
authorities
to
in those early
enable
days
long-term
seem to
flourishing
bury
of humanity
um,
within our natural planetary environment
the
through
connection of
integration
the
of
gospel
science and
story
spirituality,
with
building
astrological
upon
issues?
the long heritage of wisdom
And
contained within the
it
diverse
occurred to me
traditions
from
of
what
human
my
culture.
reading of
Thank you.
the early church was that there was quite a conflict between the hierarchical establishment in the first few
See what
centuries
he's up to.
and Gnosticism.
Okay, we're back on. We're back on.
And
We better stop.
the Gnostics
Okay.
held
All right, well,
a few
welcome
views.
back.
One of them
We'll
that the
just-
relationship between
I know
God and the individual was
a lot
something
to take in.
between God and the individual,
Quite
whereas the
complex,
hierarchical
perhaps even
church
controversial
felt
material
that
there.
there needed to
So,
be an authoritative teaching
just encourage
that everyone should
questions and comments.
comply with.
So, over to you.
The Gnostics, however, were great supporters of these astrological
Just a sec, what we'll
connections
do
that you
is I'll
spoke
just
about.
arrange
So in their fight against the
group,
Gnostics, who were the
audiovisual
supreme heretics
expert
for the early
behind the
fathers, they
microphone.
repressed anything that had a Gnostic flavour to them. And that would include
Okay,
any
so
theories that might
we do
relate
have
to
a
the
second
gospel story
microphone,
to
which, Robert will bring to you, which
other
you can
broader
use
issues.
so that your
So that's one possibility
question is
for
Yeah,
why it was buried.
This mic doesn't amplify.
And I might comment on that. And the other
Robert,
point that I wanted to make
outstanding.
was that
Unsurprisingly, thank you
I
so
see
much.
no
So I'm fascinated
conflict
by your
between,
suggestion that we are going to merge religion
ascribing to
with scientific knowledge.
the theological views, the
What is going to be the
astronomical views,
force which allows that
and
to
the
happen? Is
possibility
it going
that
to
Christ was
be
also a historical figure.
human
Both could be
intervention,
true.
or is it going to
And,
be the
my
force of
reading
Aquarius,
of the
or is
history
it going
is
to
that
be
it's certainly
godlike
true that
and
Christ was a
completely beyond our
historical figure.
comprehension and influence?
I'll respond to both those questions. I see it as I see religion as a construction of human culture, and so changes to religion are driven by underlying social and economic forces, and then people will emerge who articulate a message that aligns with those emerging. So really the overall social situation we face is one of globalization. That is, that the human community has finally become one. And it's a story which appears directly in the Bible in Matthew 24. He says that the end of the age will not come until this gospel of the kingdom has been preached to the whole inhabited earth. And my interpretation of that is not in any detailed sense, but just that everybody on the planet will have had the opportunity to have heard of Jesus Christ.
And I think that that's the case now. Like even the most remote parts of the world, people know that there's a religion called Christianity. And so finally, the very southern end of Egypt, one place where these documents survived. But when I read the Gnostic Gospels, I was quite keen to find some of this sort of material, and I was quite disappointed to see there wasn't really that much about this sort of zodiac astronomy. And whereas I see this zodiac astronomy as much more prominently within the Gospels itself, just concealed in encoded form. And so the question of the nature of Gnosticism as a movement, as a bunch of movements, is a very complex historical question. So the church fathers, who were known as the heresiologists, just studying heresy to root it out, they said one of the prime heresies was the belief in 12 ages. And so that's one of the ideas that I've presented here. So this whole framework was, I think, quite definitely heretical by the views of the church fathers. Now, my view is that a lot of the Gnostic material that survived from Valentinus and other later Gnostics from the 2nd and 3rd century, it doesn't necessarily reflect this material. That a lot of this material reflects oral traditions, which were quite strictly transmitted from mouth to ear and were not written down. But that made them intensely vulnerable to destruction. And so it's only this sort of forensic reconstruction that can identify that this sort of feature is behind the story. Now,
Thanks very much.
on the question
Robert, is that
of
working
the
or not?
historical existence of Jesus Christ, that's becoming
one of the
much
questions
more
that you
controversial.
raised, more of a mystery,
like
is
most
that
people, like certainly about 10
why
years
did the
ago,
church
I was a
authorities
believer
in those
the
early
historical
days
Jesus
seem to
until
bury
about 10 years ago. And a friend
the
introduced me to
connection
the Jesus
of the
puzzle
gospel
by Earl
story
Doherty,
with
which just goes
astrological
through the evidence.
issues.
And I think one of the a couple of things that
it occurred
really
to me
disturbed
from
me
my
were,
reading
for example,
of
Philo of Alexandria
early church
was a contemporary of
was that
Jesus,
there was
and the
quite a
if
conflict
Philo, if Jesus
between
was real, and
the hierarchical
especially if
establishment in the
did
first few
things like,
centuries
the crucifixion as
and
a
Gnosticism.
major political event, then Philo
and
would have noticed
the
it and mentioned
Gnostics,
it. Now, we can get into all
held
debates about
a few
Josephus and
views,
so on,
one of
but
them
the
that the
absence
relationship
of the
between
historical Jesus
God and the
from Philo,
individual,
but even more
or something
importantly, from the
between
epistles
God
of
and
Paul,
the individual,
that Paul
whereas the
never
hierarchical
places
church
Jesus
felt
in
that
place
there
of-
needed
in
to be an
space or time.
authoritative teaching
So there's this
that
sense that
everyone
Paul's
should
Jesus is a cosmic Jesus,
comply with.
and it's an imaginary Jesus.
The Gnostics,
and it's
however,
like the
were great
placing in
supporters
Nazareth, in Bethlehem, even in
of
Jerusalem,
these
only
astrological
came later with Mark. It's like the story
connections
started off
that
as a
you
skeleton,
spoke about.
and
So in
then
their
it was
fight against the
gradually
Gnostics,
infleshed
who were
with,
the supreme heretics
stories
for the early
that would
fathers,
enable
they repressed
popular
anything
audience
that had a Gnostic
to
flavour to them.
resonate with it,
And that would
as a way
include
of bringing people into this
any theories that
new
might relate to the gospel
institution.
story
But I think
to
that the Gnostics imagine it's a bit like the
other broader issues. So
the story
that's
of
one possibility
the Sorcerer's
for
Apprentice.
why
That
it was
the
buried.
apprentice imagined that he could control the magic broom, and it had a mind of its own to control.
And the other,
similarly,
the other
the
point
Gnostics
I
who
wanted to
put
make
this
was that
zodiac
I
cosmology
see no
into the Gospels, they thought
conflict
that they
between
could control the institution. But what they found was that Mark's Gospel story of Jesus
ascribing
of
to
Nazareth was just so wildly popular
views,
that people emerged who said, this is all completely true, and anyone who says it's not is the Antichrist. And that was the line that got into John's letters in the Bible. So anybody who criticised
my reading
the
of the
idea
history
that Jesus
is
came in the
that
flesh, is
it's
the
certainly
Antichrist, according to the
true
Bible.
that Christ was a historical figure.
That became a really powerful way of suppressing any debate. And then if you had a written document which said, oh, maybe Jesus wasn't real, then possessing that document was a capital crime for 1,000 years. So it's quite likely that that any documentary evidence would not have survived. the only place we can look is for concealed evidence. So, Jeff.
Reading on this too, and there are plenty of instances where Trajan and Pliny and so forth have written about the historical Christ. But I must say that if you read the history of the reaction of the Jewish authorities at the time, they have there's the 18 benedictions. It's a famous Jewish prayer at the time, and when the conflict between the Christian community and the Jewish authorities that had survived the destruction of Jerusalem, they introduced one of the benedictions into the so-called benedictions, and it went something like this: "Cursed be the Nazarene and all who follow him." It's pretty clear evidence that the Jewish authorities in the first century certainly believed that Jesus the Nazarene was a real person.
Really radically suppressed, and it was only at the very far fringe of the Roman Empire, at the very southern end of Egypt, one place where these documents survived. But when I read the Gnostic Gospels, I was quite keen to find some of this sort of material, and I was quite disappointed to see there wasn't really that much about this sort of zodiac astronomy. And whereas I see this zodiac astronomy as much more prominently within the Gospels itself, just in concealed and encoded form. And so the question of the nature of Gnosticism as a movement, as a bunch of movements, is a very complex historical question. So the church fathers, who were known as the heresiologists, just studying heresy to root it out, they said one of the prime heresies was the belief in 12 ages. And so that's one of the ideas that I've presented here. So this whole framework this is something that we see today heretical Jerusalem by the views of the church fathers, pretend messiahs. Now, Jesus. My view is that a lot of the Gnostic material that survived from Valentinus
proclaiming himself
other
king of the
later
Jews
Gnostics
through
from the 2nd and
his
3rd century,
triumphal entry into Jerusalem as a seditious rebel. It's the sort of
doesn't
thing
necessarily
that
reflect this
true,
material, that a lot of this material reflects oral traditions which
two
were
generations later,
quite strictly transmitted
in the Gospel of
from
Mark.
mouth to ear and were not
every
written down.
every
But that
other
made them
mention
intensely
of
vulnerable
the
to
Jesus
destruction.
of
And so it's
story
only this sort of
completely
forensic
derivative
reconstruction that can
I'll
identify
close you
them.
down now, Terry, because
But that would be really challenged heavily by lots of historians.
The historical existence of Jesus Christ. That's becoming much more controversial. It's like most people, like certainly about 10 years ago, like I was a believer in the historical Jesus until about 10 years ago. And a friend introduced me to a book, The Jesus Puzzle by Earl Doherty, which just goes through the evidence.
It's a necessary thing, because
I think
so
one of
many young people
a couple of things that really disturbed me were, for example, Philo of Alexandria was a contemporary of Jesus.
Looking in all sorts of places,
and
which isn't very healthy.
If Jesus was real, and especially if he did things like the crucifixion as a major political event, then Philo would have noticed it and mentioned it. Now, we can get into all debates about Josephus and so on, but the absence of the historical Jesus from Philo, but even more importantly from the epistles of Paul,
interesting question, because there's also a power structure there that's resisting that in the religion.
So there's this sense that
because
Paul's
there's always
Jesus
power associated with any
Jesus.
religion or any belief.
It's an imaginary Jesus.
But I see the great necessity for young people who can turn away
in Nazareth, in
from
Bethlehem,
the church,
in
which
Jerusalem,
is socializing
only
influence.
came later with Mark. It's like the story
and
started
for
off
something,
as a
and they're not
skeleton,
finding it at the
and
moment.
then it was gradually
I think that's a really central point, John.
Stories
And
that
the
would
way
enable
I view it is
the
that
popular
by
audience
interpreting
the
the
Bible
in an
as a way
allegorical
of bringing people
and,
into this
removing
new
sense of
institution.
the miraculous.
I think that the
from
Gnostics imagine it's a bit like
understanding
the
of the Bible, that it's possible
story of
to
the
retain
sorcerer's apprentice.
the
That
moral
the
and
the
ethical
apprentice imagined that he
meaning
could control
of
the
the
magic
gospel
broom
story,
and it in a way that
it makes it
compatible
had a
with
mind of its
modern
own
secular
control, understanding
and similarly
and modern
the,
secular
this-
values.
the Gnostics
And
who
I
put
see that
this,
it's really quite essential. And
zodiac
the
cosmology
church
into
is
the
in a bad
Gospels.
way. Like
They
I
thought
think that they could control
primarily
the institution, but what they found was that
Mark's
Mark's gospel
the
story
church
of Jesus of Nazareth
exposed
was
wide
just
open
so wildly popular that people emerged who said, this is all completely true, and anyone who says it's not is the Antichrist. And that was the line that got into John's letters, which I think is really quite unhealthy, because people really need to come together with a shared sense that Jesus came in the flesh, or is the Antichrist, and so Bible. We need to find that new ways became a really powerful way of suppressing religious ideas that make sense
if
for the
you
world
had a
today,
written
and
document
that's
which
really
said,
what
"Oh,
I'm trying
maybe
to
Jesus
help.
wasn't real," then possessing that document was a capital crime for 1,000 years. So it's quite likely that that any documentary evidence would not have survived. The only place we can look is the concealed evidence. So, Jeff.
Reading on this too. And there are plenty of instances where Trajan and Pliny and so forth have written about the historical Christ. But I must say that if you read the history of the reaction of the Jewish authorities at the time, they have there's the 18 benedictions. It's a famous Jewish prayer at the time. And when the conflict between the Christian community and the Jewish authorities that had survived the destruction of Jerusalem, they introduced one of the benedictions into the so-called benedictions, and it went something like this: cursed be the Nazarene and all who follow him. It's pretty clear evidence that the Jewish authorities in the first century certainly believed that Jesus the Nazarene was a real person.
Well, Kabbalah and even Tarot are esoteric traditions with a strongly, obviously Kabbalah was the Jewish esoteric tradition, and the concept of the tree of life appears in Kabbalah, where I find this whole idea of cross-cultural syncretism in the origins of Christianity really interesting is in looking at the range of cultural inputs that flowed into the construction of Christianity. So I mentioned Greece and Plato. In the break, I was talking about the role of Indian mythology, and then I think that the astrology seems to have come more from Babylon, and so the Bible presents a very strong nod towards Babylon with the three kings at the birth of Christ in the nativity story, and so there's a whole symbolism in that story. I'm sorry, as the Messiah, and this is something that we see today with the Jerusalem factors. But I will say, so there's a lot of, I believe that many Buddhism messiahs, a massive influence. But in fact, the idea monasticism as a movement was brought by Buddhists to the West. So Alexander the Great invaded India, king of the Jews, 4th century BC, establishing this connection into Jerusalem. Then in the 3rd century, the Buddhist king. It's the sort of thing, Emperor of India, sent Buddhist missionaries to the West and to the rest of the world. It simply doesn't. They established 2 generations later, Buddhist, it appears, monastery of and then Mariotis, Alexandria, and we find that so much of the teachings that are called completely derivative ethical teachings in the Bible. Look, I'll close you down now, Terry, because
that would be really challenged heavily by lots of historians.
Came out of Buddhism, but that's been so suppressed. It just raises another example of the nature of cultural imperialism, because the modern movement of classics insisted that the path of transmission of culture was from west to east. Whereas if you look to the ancient sources, you find that the real path of transmission was from east to west, that in the east there were great ancient civilizations who viewed the Europeans as barbarians. But then the Europeans were able to turn that on its head by saying that they were the cultured, civilized ones, and it was the Easterners who were the barbarians.
So very healthy in order to get a sense of
it made an awesome difference. So I hope that's enough. Jeff?
Yeah, that's right.
Or spiritual comfort.
Yes, that's right. Some of
the encoding in the early Christian era.
And we all strive towards that.
Yes. What about later on? Was this an ongoing tradition?
How that is put together is an interesting question, because there is also a power structure there that's resisting that. In the religion,
Christianity in the next 2,000 years?
There's always power associated
until the
with
Reformation, yes.
religion
so
or
if you go to all of the cathedrals of Europe,
but I see that great necessity for young people who've been turned away from the church, which is
depictions of the 12 signs of the zodiac.
Looking for something,
one of my favourites,
and they're not finding it
Saint Denis
at the moment.
in northern Paris. Look, I think that's a really central point of John, Jesus surrounded by 12 disciples, is the 12 signs of the zodiac. So this association between the Bible, the 1 to 12 relationship between the sun and the moon, removing any, I suppose, the archetypal foundation of the relationship between understanding of the Bible disciples. That flowed through to retain Christian moral iconography of the first millennium, but then the gospel story in a way that makes it compatible with modern secular understanding and modern secular values. Christianity, and I see that as really quite essential. And the church movement that is in a bad way. It's like I think the early church primarily hostile to astrology predator for its problem, pagan the church, the churches, but then astrology sort of came back in with the Gothic cathedrals, then got dumped again. I think it's just caused a collapse of trust, and so and there's this view that is really quite unhelpful, because people really need to come together with a shared sense of meaning and identity, and so we need to find new ways, definitely, of interpreting the idea of the counterculture that makes sense for the world today, and that's really what the 1960s trying to help the general popular associations with the concept of the age of Aquarius are found. And so it was this idea that a transformation of culture was possible, and so thinking about the whole idea of the generation gap in the 1960s saw the younger generation as somehow open to these new ideas, while the older conservative generation was quite hostile. My feeling was that movement never really worked through the concept of the age of Aquarius in a very coherent way, and so it lost any momentum. But it flowed through into the whole New Age movement, which is really quite a substantial. I was just in the research that I was doing for this talk, I looked at the Wikipedia page on the New Age movement, and it's quite remarkable what a wide influence New Age concepts have
and in the concept of being spiritual but not religious is part of the New Age, just the rejection of institutional church and openness to some of these magical traditions. Like, I mean, my attitude to magic is pretty complicated. Like, I follow Jung in a lot of this, where he tries to maintain a scientific approach, but still sees
Kabbalah and
experiences like synchronicity,
even tarot
as
real esoteric traditions.
So
with
it's
a strongly,
I think
obviously Kabbalah was the
1960s
Jewish
provided
esoteric
an important
tradition,
starting point,
and
and
then the concept of the tree of life
something of an intellectual
recess in
but I think
Kabbalah.
So you'd see that there
where I
was
find
indeed some kind of
this
underground
whole
current
idea
of this astrological
cross-cultural
thought that
syncretism
surfaced
in
in the age of
the
Aquarius.
origins of Christianity really
So there
interesting
was a tradition
is
you would see
in looking at
in
the
Christian
range
thought
of
underground.
cultural
Well,
inputs
there's a
that tradition flowed into the construction of Christianity. So I mentioned Greece and Plato.
just in terms of
In the break, I was talking about the role of Indian
people
mythology,
knowing the sun sign.
and
So
then
there's
I think
an
that
interest
the astrology seems to have come
just
more
native
from
astrology.
Babylon. And so the Bible presents a very strong nod towards Babylon with the three kings at the
it
birth
just
of
illustrates
Christ
that
in
there's
the
a popular
nativity
sympathy
story. And
these sorts of
so there's a
ideas.
whole
and there's a big challenge in
symbolism
putting these
in that
ideas
story.
into any sort of
I'm
coherent,
sorry,
persuasive,
I can't really talk
rigorous form.
about Jewish and Muslim factors, but I will say that I believe that Buddhism has had a massive influence. In fact, that monasticism as a movement was brought by Buddhists to the West. So Alexander the Great invaded India in the 4th century BC, establishing this connection. Then in the 3rd century, the Buddhist king Ashoka, emperor of India, sent Buddhist missionaries to the West and to the rest of the world. They established the Buddhist monastery of Lake Mariotis in Alexandria, and we find that so much of the teachings that are called Q, the ethical teachings in the Bible, have a direct link to Buddhism. And so there's this sense that so much of the ethical tradition within the Gospels came out of Buddhism, but that's been so suppressed. It just raises another example of the nature of cultural imperialism, because
to the Albert Hall that night.
the modern movement of classics insisted that the path of transmission of culture was from west
read
to
a number
east.
of his books.
Whereas if you look to the ancient sources, you find that the real path of transmission was
my
from east to
understanding
west, that in the
is
east, the great ancient civilizations retains who viewed the Europeans as barbarians.
Jesus.
But then
that he doesn't
the Europeans
really,
were able to turn that on its head by saying that they were the cultured, civilized ones, and it was the Easterners who were the barbarians. So he was, I think,
it made an awesome
more
difference.
more along the line
I hope
of
that's
books like Jesus Without Christianity, where there's a sense
Other-
that the churches have
The
just got it
encoding
wrong.
in the early
So-
Christian era,
so that the churches,
church fathers.
and it's especially with sort of
Yes. What about
major
later on? Was this an
popular
ongoing
doctrines
tradition
like
through the
the
papacy or the
heaven and hell,
Cathars or other
the
heretics? You would see
belief in miracles that spawned
Christianity in the next
to
2,000 years.
presented version of Christianity
the Reformation, yes.
that
So if you go
made
to all of the
sense
cathedrals
from
of
a modern
Europe,
scientific
they
view,
generally have
without
very
really,
strong astrological
going
motifs.
into any
So
of this
Chartres
sort of
Notre
more
Dame,
controversial
of the
type of
the 12 signs of the zodiac. One of my
speculation
favourites
that
Saint
I've
Denis
presented.
in
So the idea that Jesus didn't
magnificent
exist,
rose
I'll
window
just give you a quick
of
pot of
Jesus
history of it.
surrounded by the
It
12
was
disciples and
it first
the 12
came into
signs of the
public
zodiac.
view. So this
time of the
association, which was the
between
first time it was legal to
the 1
raise
to
that
12
with,
relationship
French
between the
thinkers
sun
like
and the moon
Dupuy and
formed,
others,
I suppose, the
comparing
archetypal
Jesus
foundation
as a sun
of
god.
the
Then there was a whole range of
relationship
19th
between
century
Jesus
authors
and the 12
who
disciples
explored
and
comparison
that flowed
between
through
Jesus and
into,
other rising and
Christian,
dying gods.
then
The most
iconography
prominent
first millennium,
disbeliever
then
in the historical
I think
Jesus
more with the rise of
was
Protestantism,
the Lenin, the Russian
came to
dictator.
be
And I think
more of
he
a
did
strong split
a big disservice
between,
because he
Christianity
he
and
put the idea of the non-existence of
astrology.
Jesus in the
But
context
so, like, it's a
of
movement that
atheist
came
communist
and went.
revolution.
It's
so
like
the
in
League
the
of
early
Knowledge and
church,
Godless, that
they
sort
were
of
quite hostile
attitude,
to astrology
which
for its
is really a
pagan,
very different sort of
content.
approach.
But then
I'm looking
astrology
at
sort of came back
quite
in
a
with the
a
Gothic
way of
cathedrals,
recovering
then it,
the inner
dumped
meaning
again, and
of
I think
Christianity
it's going
rather
to come
than
back in again.
attacking it. Because what's happened with the rejection of the existence of Jesus, it's been so associated with atheism that it's the idea that if we can prove that Jesus was fiction, then we can expect to see religion disappear. And I think that that's a profoundly
Yes,
misguided
definitely.
attitude, because
So
I think that religion is just essential
the
for
idea of the
human
counterculture
and society
the hippie
and health.
movement in the 1960s is where the general
Thanks for your talk, Robbie.
associations
You look at
of the age of Aquarius
the constellations in the sky that you're looking at,
and
humans have said these are I mean, there are groups of stars in the sky, but we've said they're these particular animals or figures, and then we've said these particular figures have this sort of meaning, therefore Aquarius has this sort of meaning, Pisces has this sort of meaning. I mean, I can see that, yes, you know, there is a movement of the equinoxes and everything. I understand that, but to actually project onto that, you know, this age of Aquarius will mean a time of where we move from belief to knowledge. I mean, that just seems like fantasy to me. You know, there's no reality to that. That's just something. You know, it's like
it's actually true, very coherent way, and so it lost.
But that's not connected to those constellations. If there's a change, there's no kind of connection. Those constellations haven't caused that change.
Quite a substantial. I was just constellations research that I was doing for this talk. I looked at the Wikipedia page on the New Age movement, and it's quite remarkable what a wide influence New Age concepts have, and the concept of being spiritual but not religious is part of the New Age, just the rejection of the institutional church and openness to some of these magical traditions. Like, I mean, my attitude to magic is pretty complicated. Like, I follow Jung in a lot of this, where he tries to maintain a scientific approach, but still sees experiences like synchronicity as real. And so it's, I think that the 1960s provided an important starting point, but and then that movement went into something of an intellectual recess, but I think it'll come back.
So you'd see that there was indeed some kind of underground current of this
It's driven by the date when the Earth is closest to the Sun, which is the
surfaced
perihelion.
in the Age of
This
Aquarius.
was a part of my talk I didn't have time to
So there
to
was a
include.
tradition
But at the
you would see
perihelion
moving
each year is about 4th of December, sorry, 4th of January.
underground.
And
there's
so
tradition
it takes 20,000 years
like
to
astrology
go around the full cycle of the seasons.
immensely popular.
So
Just in
there's
terms
a
of
correlation between the idea of the perihelion date and the changes in culture. An interest which then can be linked to this age of Aquarius, but not. I'm not suggesting at all any causality from stars, and that's a sort of basic misunderstanding, which is really pervasive in relation to astrology. With the belief and knowledge idea, it's more just starting from the idea that that cultural evolution is shifting the world from a basis of social values in belief toward a basis of social values in knowledge.
But that has nothing to do with going from Pisces to Aquarius.
It's only a coincidence. So the thing is that astrology has traditionally said the theme of Pisces is belief and the theme of Aquarius is knowledge. And there's a coincidence between that and the...
So it's a coincidence that you're talking about,
well,
then?
At one level, it's a coincidence, but at another level, there's a causality. And the fact that there's a surface coincidence doesn't eliminate the possibility of causality. And when you place it into the context of the climate cycle, then you can start to see the dynamic structure of the causality. And then essentially the astrology functions as somewhat like a myth.
Yeah, I think it's a myth, and I don't think it helps looking at star signs and thinking they're reflecting kind of... I don't find it helpful. I don't understand it, obviously, the way you do, but, you know, I don't see any reality to it. But, you know, looking at constellations and thinking that moving through those constellations reflects kind of something that how we project onto those constellations. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. We project certain characteristics onto those constellations, and to say...
And I read a number of his books, but it's a long time ago that I read them. And my understanding is that he retains a belief in the historical Jesus, and that he doesn't really engage in this sort of positive view about New Age concepts. So he was, it's dangerous, I think, looking more along the line of books like Jesus Without Christianity, where there's a sense that the churches have just got it wrong. So that the churches, and it's especially with sort of major popular doctrines.
For example, if you look at the way coral spawns on a certain day of the full moon, over a very wide area, it's not just one coral next to its neighbour having some influence, but over a huge area they come out on a certain day. We just don't understand how that could relate specifically to
present a version of Christianity that made sense from a modern scientific view without really going into any of this sort of more controversial type of speculation that I've presented. So the idea that Jesus didn't exist, I'll just give you a quick potted history of it. It was it first came into public view at the time of the French Revolution, which was the first time it was legal to raise that, with French thinkers like Dupuy and others comparing Jesus to as a sun god. Then there was a whole range of 19th century authors who explored comparison between Jesus and other rising and dying gods. Then the most prominent disbeliever in the historical Jesus was V.I. Lenin, the Russian dictator. And I think he did a big disservice, because he put the idea of the non-existence of Jesus in the context of atheist communist revolution. So the League of the Militant Godless, that sort of attitude, which is really a very different sort of approach. I'm looking at quite a way of recovering the inner meaning of Christianity rather than attacking it. Because what's happened with the rejection of the existence of Jesus, it's been so associated with atheism that it's the idea that if we can prove that Jesus was fiction, then we can expect to see religion disappear. And I think that that's a profoundly misguided attitude, because I think that religion is just essential for human society and health. Shauna.
Thanks for your talk, Robbie. Look, you know, you look at the constellations in the sky that you're looking at, and humans have said these are there are groups of stars in the sky, but we've said they're these particular animals or figures, and then we've said these particular figures have this sort of meaning, therefore Aquarius has this sort of meaning, Pisces has this sort of meaning. I mean, I can see that, yes, you know, there is a movement of the equinox is and everything. I understand that. But to actually project onto that, you know, this age of Aquarius will mean a time of where we move from belief to knowledge. I mean, that just seems like fantasy to me. You know, there's no reality to that. That's just something, you know, it's like...
But it's actually true, because what we can see over the last 2,000 years is
But that's not connected to those constellations.
No,
if there's a change, there's no kind of connection. Those constellations haven't caused that change.
Well, it's not the constellations that cause the change. I used the example of a clock which is fast approaching 10 o'clock. And the number 12 behind the minute hand doesn't cause the fact that it's 12 o'clock any more than the distant stars cause there's a whole physics of astrology which actually makes sense, surprisingly enough, which you wouldn't know from the views of scientists who are really deeply ignorant about it. But the connection here, Shauna, is more, there is a climate cycle which has been stable over the last 4 billion years, which has this roughly 20,000 year pattern of changes of light and dark. And so this idea of a climate year over that sort of period, which has the same sort of cyclic structure as the annual year, is a way to start to approach that. And in that framework, where we're now in, it's driven by the date when the Earth is closest to the Sun, which is called the perihelion. And this was a part of my talk I didn't have time to include. But the perihelion is each year is about 4th of January. And so it takes 20,000 years to go around the full cycle of the seasons. So there's a correlation between the idea of the perihelion date and the changes in culture, which then can be linked to this age of Aquarius, but I'm not suggesting at all any causality from stars. And that's a sort of basic misunderstanding, which is really pervasive in relation to astrology. With the belief and knowledge idea, it's more just starting from the idea that that cultural evolution is shifting the world from a basis of social values in belief toward a basis of social values in knowledge.
But that has nothing to do with going from Pisces to Aquarius.
It's only a coincidence. So the thing is that astrology has traditionally said the theme of Pisces is belief and the theme of Aquarius is knowledge. And there's a coincidence between that and
So it's a coincidence that you're talking about,
well,
then?
At one level, it's a coincidence, but at another level, there's a causality, and the fact that there's a surface coincidence doesn't eliminate the possibility of causality, and when you place it into the context of the climate cycle, then you can start to see the dynamic structure of the causality, and then essentially the astrology functions as somewhat like a myth.
Yeah, I think it's a myth, and I don't think it helps looking at star signs and thinking they're reflecting kind of. I don't find it helpful. I don't understand it, obviously, the way you do, but I don't see any reality to it. But looking at constellations and thinking that moving through those constellations reflects kind of something that how we project onto those constellations. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. We project certain characteristics onto those constellations, and say
this is the issue. It's not at all about looking at constellations. It's about looking at the natural structure of the year, and this is where there are these cyclic patterns that divide the year into 2, 3, 4, 6, 12 parts, and each of those monthly parts has a distinct nature. So this is where you can start to develop the physics of the idea, and I think it's dangerous to take the superficial mythology as a reason to dismiss the hypothesis, because the hypothesis actually has got a scientific depth to it, which is not contradicted by this surface mythology.
For example, if you look at the way coral spawns on a certain day of the full moon, over a very wide area, it's not just one coral's next to its neighbour having some influence, but over a huge area they come out on a certain day. We just don't understand how that could relate specifically to the moon.